Professor LaPira, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with your background? Where'd you start off, the arc of your career so far, and where you are now?
Sure. I started off in the late 90s after graduating college, working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress from Pennsylvania, both in the district and in Washington. So I got a sort of a feel of sort of the both sides of the coin. From there, had some really interesting experiences working on the Hill. But at the time, I always knew I wanted to pursue an academic career. So went on to graduate school to study Congress, and then met who would become my PhD advisor, who was working on a project on lobbying and public policy. And I really became fascinated by that because it spoke a little bit more to my day-to-day experiences of having worked in Congress that I knew so little about many of the lobbyists and folks who I met. And so started doing some research in that area. And before I finished my PhD, I got a job working at the Center for Responsive Politics, now known as Open Secrets, that has long published information on federal campaign finance projects. And at the time, I was hired to come on to create their lobbying database and later their revolving door database. So I spent a couple of years building up that those databases based on some of the experience I had in my own research, and then moved on to my academic career and became a professor. And I've now been here at Madison University in my 11th year. And much of the work that I have done stems from those experiences. So much of my published work and my teaching, where I talk about lobbying and interest group politics, relies on the lobbying data that I produce. And that has then I've also sort of relied on my own background as a congressional staffer in the past to look at some questions about legislative capacity and information processing. And then that brought me to, in 2019, I was the American Political Science Association Public Service Fellow at the House Select Committee on Modernization of Congress, where I got to work on some of these issues about staffing and do some internal research there and some consulting. So now I'm back here in Harrisonburg on campus, and I do my teaching and research, and I'm recently just started as the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Interest Groups and Advocacy.
Excellent. So, I think you're one of the few academics I've come across who's worked for a member, but in the district as well as the the DC office. Can you talk about what experience did you actually have when you were a staffer, both in the district and in DC?
Yeah, well, absolutely. When I was working in the district, it just so happened to be 1998, and that is, of course, when Congress impeached President Clinton. So as a relatively entry-level staffer dealing mostly with constituent concerns, whether it be sort of immigration issues or Social Security or whatnot, intervened by phone calls from constituents calling up to express their opinions and to learn what the member of Congress was how he was voting and what his intentions were, and providing that general constituent service. Of course, during the impeachment era, it's sort of everything sort of screeched to a halt, and that dominated all of public discussion, whether it was the comedy shows at night or the news, and very similarly, it dominated my time in the office. I would walk in, the phone would already be ringing at 7:30 or 8 a.m. and wouldn't stop until we left at 6:30 at night. It eventually became a real challenge, and that I didn't feel like I was really sinking my teeth into sort of interesting work. And it was just so happened to be at that time my boss knew it and asked me to come down to DC and to work for him, where it was a real experience of trial by fire. My very first week there, a subcommittee that my boss was on was having a legislative hearing on what would later become the 1999 Gramm-Leach-Bliley Financial Services Modernization Act, which fundamentally changed how the financial services industry is regulated, as you surely know. But not only did I get to start there, because my boss was on one of the primary committees that had jurisdiction on the bill, he went all the way to the conference committee, which is a rare event in a legislative staffer's life, that I was able to really sink my teeth in and observe how what that sort of behind the scenes process that you don't learn about in a textbook on Congress, about how things really work, and about building relationships with stakeholders and understanding how different members of Congress are going to approach similar problems differently. So it was a really great experience, even though I was, again, a relatively junior staff member, to be a fly on the wall in that conference room, in that conference committee room, when the Secretary of Treasury was there, and the White House Chief of Staff would pop his head in, so it was a really interesting experience to get both these sort of on the ground communication with constituents who don't call a member of Congress's office with good news, and all the way up through these sort of really sort of complex procedures and substantive debates about figuring out, well, how do we go about solving these problems that it's clear that everyone knows that they need to be solved, but what exactly is the solution?
So why did you wind up ultimately going to academia, within a university setting, rather than doing a think tank gig or staying on the Hill?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often tell my students that I left a low-paying job on Capitol Hill and took a 60% pay cut to go to graduate school. I think I always had it in my mind that that was just simply what I wanted to pursue, and it was the way I know myself and the way I work. There is a certain amount of autonomy that comes with working in the academic world. So the way I looked at it was, I moved from a job where I was signing my boss's names on letters and memos to one where I put my own name on my own work product. And so that made a lot of difference. Now, of course, that also means that my work ends up in dusty old academic journals that most people don't read. But I think one change in the academic world and social science generally, and political science in particular, is that there has been a real change in emphasis of trying to translate what we do in our discipline and studying things like Congress and the presidency, and trying to translate that into a more general consumption for a broader audience to hopefully have at least some impact, change the direction of some conversations about how government works and how politics works. So I found that move over the years to be very rewarding.
Right, well, let's move on to your, sort of what I call a broad range of your research. What are the broad questions you're interested in terms of either Congress or politics, generally speaking, and then we'll dive down into the Congress-related stuff.
Sure. I would say, well, generally speaking, I study politics that happens inside the Beltway, right? So, which is very different from, sort of political parties and elections and the media, all of which is important, but my focus tends to be on political elites, right? People whose job it is to be engaged in the world of public policy and in politics. That's about as broad or as general as I could describe it. What that really means in particular is most of the research I've done is looked at organized interest groups, particularly in U.S. national politics, and the individual lobbyists that they hire, and sort of thinking about lobbyists, their individual characteristics, their professional background, their education, other human assets that they might bring to their job. So generally that's been a focus of what I've tried to contribute and learn about. And some of the questions that I've looked at there are sort of, what's the relationship between the priorities that the government has and how that actually draws lobbyists into the process, right? So we often think about lobbying as these sort of lobbyists are these interlocutors, right, from the outside, telling the Senate and the House what to do, and it doesn't really work that way. Lobbyists tend to follow the lead of the partisans inside Congress and in the White House. I've also looked at in a lot of this work, because of trying to collect data from publicly available disclosure reports. Along the way, you learn a lot about what they don't tell you, right? So some of my work has also looked at sort of the effectiveness of lobbying, transparency, and disclosure. And then inside Congress, the predominant academic view of Congress, and for good reason, is really to think of Congress as a set of institutions and norms and rules, and then in which elected members of Congress try to manipulate those institutions for their own re-election and political and partisan reasons. But what is often, I thought, has been missing from that is really looking under what's the day-to-day operational a basis of Congress, where Congress as an actual organization, as an employer, not just as the first branch and the first constitutional branch of government, but really how does it work under the hood? And I came to this largely speaking and broadly speaking of legislative capacity and trying to understand personnel and staff in Congress was directly related to my work on lobbyists, because who are the lobbyists? There are people who used to work in government. So my first book was on so-called revolving door lobbying with Trey Thomas. And one of the conclusions we reached there that if we are concerned about this very close relationship between lobbyists and the government and Congress in particular, we need to understand a little bit more of why does Congress need to rely so much on K Street and these sort of these lobbyists that have special access to members of Congress. And that's largely coming from the fact that, and I think we can get into this, is because Congress is largely divested in its own internal resources. And then I think a third sort of area which I'm interested in is, generally speaking, these political professionals inside the Beltway. They are highly trained, highly experienced, and typically very motivated by public service. The question then becomes is how do they go about using the vast amounts of information that's around in order to offer advice or to make policy decisions or to communicate those decisions to certain publics and whatnot. There's the problem in Washington is not that there's not enough information about how to solve problems. It's that there's too much information, and what we don't know then is exactly how do political elites winnow that information down to what's most useful and effective.
Well, let's start off with the work on lobbying. I think that was your earliest work. So why don't we, if you could share with us, what questions really did you have about lobbying? What was the fundamental problem you were trying to solve? And did you find any interesting outcomes from that work?
Yeah, sure. I think for decades, I think the focus of social science research on lobbying and interest group politics more generally, economists look at this stuff, sociologists look at this stuff, political scientists. The focus of investigation has typically been at the organization or the group level, and that's revealed a lot of telling information about how our political system works. Predominated, it tends to be dominated by for-profit interests, whether they're going to be lobbying directly or through professional associations and trade associations and whatnot. But it's overwhelmingly having to do with this firms in the marketplace, and it's not only nonprofits and certain policy advocates. But where I thought there was really a dearth of knowledge about how all of this stuff works was sort of one level down from the organization, the individual people who actually engage in these lobbying activities on behalf of these organizations. There's a lot of really interesting questions there that, how do they go about faithfully representing the interest of these organizations or these organizations' members or shareholders or officers? As in any sort of complex organization, you're always going to have some agency cost and agency loss when you're representing somebody else. And we didn't really know a lot about individual lobbyists, right? So what drove me to some of these questions was really to learn more. Who are the lobbyists, right? So to try to move away from this perspective of thinking that lobbyists were simply interchangeable, semiconductors of representation for the interests that they represented, and they're actually human beings, and some have and they have different characteristics and qualities, and lobbying is not a one-size-fits-all kind of activity, right? So so started drilling down and trying to learn a little bit more about these. So what ultimately became a series of papers and my first book on revolving door lobbyists was really about individual lobbyists, whether they had previously worked in the government or not. And so what we did was we got a long sort of list took a big random sample of lobbyists from 1 year, and over the course of a couple of years, brought on some student research assistants that who we asked to essentially Google stalk these lobbyists, right, and find out everything you can about them, because the lobbying disclosure reports does not include a resume, right? It doesn't include their biography. It just includes a name. And so what we try to do is effectively reconstruct their resumes behind the scenes and create a data set out of it, and then ask, well, then what can that tell us? And of course, that had us focus on a couple of different things. The first and foremost big thing that we need to understand about how lobbying works is that it's very different depending on their sort of professional context. Some lobbyists collect one paycheck from one client, their employer, right? They work in-house, not unlike an in-house accountant or counsel. And they have a very different job compared to a lobbyist who might work at a lobbying firm or a law firm who might have dozens of clients with competing interests, or at least a variety of interests. So right there, we can simply, it doesn't take too much thought to realize that the qualities of the person who's going to be working in-house and going to be working as a consultant can be very different, right? So the in-house type person is going to be more of a sort of a policy wonk, a substance expert, and they're also going to sort of have to cover a lot of bases internally. Whereas somebody at a consulting firm or a lobbying or law firm, their professional qualities are going to be more about what they know about the sort of inside process. How does the White House really work on the inside? Or how does the Senate Democratic Majority Leader, how do they really function? Or a particular committee. That tends to be much more valuable on that side than literally having the nuts and bolts of, say, technocratic healthcare policy or whatnot. So so that was one major distinction. And the second one, naturally, which was largely became in the mid-2000s, there was a lot of discussion in the public about the role of lobbyists and the close relationship of lobbyists with members of Congress, especially if they were former staffers. So I'm thinking particularly around the Jack Abramoff scandal of the mid-2000s, a lot of journalists really, and policymakers and lawmakers started asking questions about, well, should we stop the spinning of the so-called revolving door? Is this a sort of setting up a natural conflicts of interest, right? So we tried to drill down into these individual characteristics now that we had a bunch of lobbyist resumes to ask, well, do they behave differently? Are they different kinds of lobbyists? And of course, it's difficult to know because we're not in the room when they're actually engaged in lobbying. We're trying to extract as much information as we can from their public disclosure reports, which is thin information. But what we did reveal was that they indeed are very different, right? So that somebody without previous government experience is usually going to be an expert in an industry, or they'll have a certain expertise in a particular area of law or public policy. And they're much more likely to have a very narrow focus, a narrow portfolio in which they're going to be engaged, and they're going to have a very small network of professionals that they interact with. Compare that to somebody who had worked in government before. Even though, say, working on the Hill or in the White House, you're going to pick up something about policy substance along the way, the real value is not necessarily that you could pick up the phone and call your old boss, but it's being able to advise your clients without picking up the phone and calling your own boss, of telling them most likely what was going to happen. Where most people, so we developed this idea in the book that lobbying is not necessarily sort of arm twisting and influence per se, but it acts more like an insurance policy, right? An interest group is going to hire different kinds of lobbyists to cover different kinds of risks. That and this is why it makes sense that a lot of sort of corporate interests are going to hire lobbyists, right? That they want to have the intelligence internally because they have business planning to do, or they have some kind of policy goal. And so they're going to hire these different kinds of lobbyists to cover different kinds of problems or risks. So I think that the bottom line, what we hope to learn from there is that we're less concerned about these sort of insider connections, because frankly, any lobbyist can create connections given due time. But really what the distinguishing factor of somebody who has government experience is that they have that sort of innate knowledge about the informal norms and practices about how policymakers go about making decisions on very controversial issues that can be touchy. So, so that I think was one of sort of the big sort of takeaways of by what we learned from drilling down beyond just the organization and looking at characteristics of individual lobbyists and advocates.
And so from the economics point of view for the individual lobbyists, the way that they make money, either through client, multi-client or single client kind of relationships, it's always been a kind of a curious question about effectiveness, right? How do their clients know what they're getting? And I would assume that, my guess is that 90% of that spend is wasted, right? Maybe more.
Probably.
Because there's such a information asymmetry between the lobbyist and the client. Did you get into that at all in your work? And what did you find in terms of what do people think they're paying for and what do they actually get at the end of the day?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really key question, right? It's I think very difficult for one lobbyist to go back to one client and say, I changed a law for you, right? Because Congress is a collective decision-making body with two competing parties that are concerned about re-election, not necessarily what one organization needs or wants out of the policy process. So it's, I think, a real challenge for lobbyists to show that particular value, right? So they can occasionally show or demonstrate very sort of incremental outputs, if you will. We got so many meetings on Capitol Hill, or we produced, we got some language in an amendment at a committee, but those things are relatively far and few between. 365 days in the year, that those things are not happening all the time, which is why I think our analogy, or our theoretic analogy with insurance is good, right? So I own homeowners insurance in case someday there's a hurricane that hits my house. I don't need it today. There's not going to be a hurricane today, right? But if I don't have it, that's when it becomes a problem. So I think the real value that lobbyists are going to be demonstrating is that you need to spend that money in advance and have them when you need it under uncertain circumstances, when nobody has a crystal ball to predict when the government is going to drop the next shoe in the industry, or when some sort of outside factor disrupts the public policy process, or simply a new law needs to be addressed or created, or some kind of problem needs to happen. You're only going to get anything out of the system if you already have the lobbyists ahead of time, which is quite literally why especially multi-client contract lobbyists work on a retainer basis, right? Because they quite literally can't demonstrate on a day-to-day basis what it is that they're proving or they're delivering for their client. But I would, you point to it and say it's very rare for organizations to pull out of those consulting contracts. They're getting something out of it. And typically what that is, it's going to be the sort of insider ear to the ground about what's actually happening in Washington. A CEO in California can't afford to read in the paper what happened in Congress the day after, right? They need to know the week in advance what hearing is happening, or is there going to be a vote on a bill that's going to affect them, or is there are they going to close that tax loophole that they rely on, what have you? So those are the kinds of things that it's not so much that that lobbyists are going to be changing the course of events in the policy process. It's their informational value that that their clients rely on to reduce their uncertainty. And as a business person yourself, I think you probably know that the number one thing you want to reduce is your uncertainty about how about your business landscape. And It's just one way of looking at it. And mostly from these sort of large associations and corporations, there's about $3 to $4 billion a year spent on lobbying at the federal level. It's probably much more than that, but at least that's what's disclosed. We spend $15 billion on Valentine's Day gifts, right? So it really is a drop in the bucket, I think, for companies and associations to be able to obtain that intelligence that's going to help feed their day-to-day operations and their business planning. So that's really the value, I think, that they can offer is, again, which is why revolving door lobbyists are so much more valuable, because they can offer some insight to the moving parts of Congress and the White House that you can't see from the outside.
It's interesting you talk about the insurance value of the lobbying, whereas, a lot of people's perception is more like the shaping concept. I want this done. I want this in the bill. I want this legislation passed. So is that largely a myth, or does that happen in certain circumstances, or is there specialization to do that? How does that play out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't think it's a myth per se. This certainly does happen. But to the best of our knowledge, really how it works is lobbyists act almost as adjunct staff or as outside consultants to members of Congress, right? So typically lobbyists are only going to be reaching out to people who they already agree with, right? So they're not changing their minds so much. There's a really a useful theory out there called the lobbying as legislative subsidy from Rick Hall and Alan Deardorff that basically says that what an interest group and what a lobbyist is trying to do is to walk into a legislator's office and offer them what they call a matching grant, right? If you put 5% of your time on this problem, I'll make up for the 95% remaining with my expertise. We'll go talk to the relevant constituencies. We'll, feel out stakeholders for you, as long as you can spend 5% of your time on it. 5% of their time is better than 0% of their time. So to the extent that they're influencing the process, it's changing their priorities and how they spend and how they allocate their time and resources inside Congress. It's not necessarily changing their mind. I mean, they're always going to, if the bill comes up, they're going to vote along with that, right? But it's that if the bill comes up, part of the legislative process that is a lot more arcane and a lot more complex, and it's where I think lobbyists can be valuable. So lobbyists have two audiences, right? One is their clients or the members of their organization or their shareholders that they're trying to feed information to. But they also have their targets on Capitol Hill or the White House or at Department of Agriculture or what have you. And they have to be useful to them. They have to be partners in the policy process, and they work as allies or as adjuncts. So to say that most lobbyists are really information providers back to their clients or are offering some kind of insurance, it also those sort of retainer contracts or working in-house at an organization with a Washington office also buys them the time to move the needle slightly forward on a very slow pace for whatever their policy priorities might be. So it works in both directions there. But I think that whole story is very different than sort of the folk theory that that lobbyists are sort of, there's a famous political cartoon out there where a member of Congress is saying that lobbyists don't tell me what to do, where the pencil is written by the lobbyist, right? Which I think is brilliant, but it's also completely wrong. It's not really accurate in describing what role lobbyists play, because otherwise members of Congress or their offices, thousands of lobbyists could walk in the door on any given day. They have to decide which ones are we going to let through the door, and the ones they're going to let through the door are the ones that are going to be most useful to them. So I think this story is consistent on both ends, but really runs counter sort of the popular mythology of what lobbying is.
So maybe that leads us to the next big topic, which is congressional capacity, right? Because if, in theory, if Congress had a massive amount of resources to do focus on all the areas they wanted to, they wouldn't need lobbyists at all under that scenario. So can you talk about, the legislative capacity questions that you've posed, and what have you found in that regard?
Yeah, so this is another area where in social science, it's been a particularly sort of underemphasized or understood aspect of the policymaking process, and in particular Congress, where my discipline has made leaps and bounds in the past 30, 40 years, is really understanding, the costs and benefits and constraints and trade-offs of how different rules work, and how institutional structures work, and thinking about, decision veto points and the role of political party leaders. And we've really made a lot of advances in understanding Congress is more than just like happenstance going about doing its business. But that hyper focus on rules that has informed us a lot about how things work, and also the incentives that parties have to differentiate themselves, which is really underlying the polarization that we've witnessed in the past 20, 30 years. What has really not been observed as much as it was probably in say the 1960s and 1970s, when scholars were looking in Congress, is how does the day-to-day operation of the particular kinds of offices in Congress work, right? So the average American probably thinks of Congress as one big monolith, but it's not. What Congress is, it's a collection of both. Of course, it's separated into two chambers, which are completely independent from each other. They don't tell each other how to do their work. Even within those chambers, there are party offices, party leader offices that have their own sort of resources and autonomy. There are congressional committees where the so-called work of Congress gets done, that operate with a lot of autonomy. And 535, or actually 540 members, if you include the 5 members of the House that don't have a formal vote, that have their own sort of operations. They have their own office, they have their own budgets, they hire their own staff in particular. And if we think about it that way, while these like larger political forces that are sort of driving the gridlock and the dysfunction and the political polarization between the parties that we're witnessing, the question about, well, in this as the political context changes for Congress to do whatever it needs to do or wants to do, how have members and committees and party leaders inside Congress changed how they allocate their own resources to achieve their goals, right? So if I'm an economist and I'm looking at a Fortune 500 company, I'm going to look at their balance sheet and see where they're spending their money and where their investments are, and that's going to tell me what their priorities are, right? Well, same thing with Congress. I can look at how do they go about spending their money, and what does that tell us about politics, and about at least what members of Congress, without saying it out loud, what does that tell us about what they believe the legislature ought to be doing? And so there's, generally speaking, Nelson Polsby, a famous political scientist, really said that in the world, there's really 2 kinds of legislatures. It's probably an oversimplification, but the first legislature would be a transformative one that solves problems. It ends hunger, it fights wars, it makes economies grow, and improves the human condition, what have you. And the other version is one of a legislature as an arena. It is merely a place where voices can be heard. The goal is not to sort of achieve some outcome other than to simply have voices heard. And neither one is necessarily better or worse than the other, but how that informs us is it tells us what Congress is. It helps us understand the motives and incentives behind Congress, and by looking at how they allocate their resources, it can tell us what kind of legislature it wants to be, or its members want it to be. Do they want it to be transformative, or do they want it to be an arena? And the worst way to answer that question is to ask a member of Congress. If you ask a member of Congress, what is your goal, and what are you trying to do now that you've been elected to this office? They will almost to a T tell you, I'm here to solve problems on behalf of my constituents and serve the American people. Well, they can say that on one day, but I want to observe their behavior in order to really to determine, are you there to solve problems, or are you there to do something else? And so I think in recent years, in recent decades, I think the answer is to do something else. It is more to the simple way of observing this is the day after the election is over, members of Congress are thinking about the next election. They're not necessarily thinking about, okay, now that I'm in office, what problems do I solve? And of course, they're not going to tell you that, right? Because they have no re-election incentive to do so. So, how I got to this question was stemming from, ironically, my work on revolving door lobbyists, and trying to think about what that relationship is between the world of special interests and Capitol Hill. One of the conclusions we drew there was, just as you intimated going into this, was that if you reduce the government's reliance on outside expertise by increasing its own internal expertise, then we become less concerned about what those relationships are. And so then that just opens up a very straightforward empirical question: is how is Congress spending its money today versus how it spent its money 20 and 30 years ago, right? So what changes have these broader political forces of polarization and in particular heightened competition, electoral competition between the parties? What has that meant? So I've done a couple of different things here. One's primarily, we've looked at, and one of the best ways to get some insight on this is, it is public information, how members of Congress spend their money, especially on their employee payrolls. That information has recently been digitized from 2000 on, and working with a group of colleagues, we digitized some that went back even before 2000 to really look at some questions of how has this changed over time. So in a recent paper, in a broader project, we asked this question of like how, especially in particular, individual members. We limited our scope to the House of Representatives just because we didn't have the time and energy to do otherwise. Was how are they spending money differently today than members of Congress were 30 years ago? And the answer is absolutely yes. And back in the day when I worked on the Hill as a young, just out of college, a student, members of Congress tended to spend the majority of their available public resources, taxpayer dollars, on staff with policy expertise. So the job of staff, like when I moved to Washington in 1998, was we had a policy portfolio, and I monitored policy, and I came up with recommendations about bills to co-sponsor or amendments to legislation and whatnot. And that required me to have a certain amount of expertise. And we had one person in the office who served as our press secretary. And the job there was to sort of monitor how the media was speaking back in the district and nationally and whatnot. Well, now you fast forward, and what this disbursement data is telling us is that folks like me, the legislative policy type folks, in that office, there was 5 of us that did legislative work. There's now on average going to be 2 people in a member of Congress's office, 2 or 3. Now, instead of having one press secretary, you have a communications director, you have a social media manager, you have a constituent communications person, right? So what they've done, even though the pie has not changed necessarily, they've reallocated that pie away from policy work and more towards communications and public relations work. Now, what that tells me is that what that means is that Congress is less concerned about solving public problems through oversight and investigation and the normal sort of legislative process, and become much more concerned using these public dollars for effectively re-election campaigns. And so these activities are certainly important because it is important to keep constituents informed. It's important to keep members of Congress up to date on what the sort of the general conversation is in the public. But it's been a very stark a shift away from legislative offices acting as essentially policy shops and shifting to become essentially PR shops on behalf of the member. And largely, we think the reason why is that back in the 60s and 70s and through even the 80s, frankly speaking, the Republicans were never going to gain the majority in the House. It was just baked into the cake. But as things shifted, moving into the 90s, the House and also the Senate later became just about every single election, either party could conceivably win or retain the majority, right? And you know, that's within margins, right? But it's at least possible. And so they have completely reshifted their focus towards these sort of re-election and messaging activities, which leaves very little time, of course, to do the dirty work of studying problems and talking to experts, sifting through all this information and developing solutions. And then, of course, the hard work of building coalitions to support, to build support behind any solutions that you come up with. There's still only 24 hours in a day. So when you shift from one activity to the next, it doesn't leave much. And then you add on top of that the fact that the costs of campaigns have become so expensive, and so the demand for raising funds now dominates members of Congress time. So even the rare times that they are in Washington, about half of that time is spent dialing for dollars and not in the committee rooms with their shirt sleeves rolled up and solving problems.
Well, that's one of the problems when we talk about capacity and increasing the budget or increasing salaries. You know, if all that money and all those salaries go to constituent services or PR, then there's no capacity increase in Congress whatsoever. So I'm curious about your opinion on that, and whether you think, you know, and I would even ask a more fundamental question, which is whether any constituent service budget is justified based on what Congress is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start with the first, or start with the second part of that. Absolutely, I do think Congress does have a responsibility to act as a couple of things that are involved in constituent service. One is simply communicating unfiltered, unmediated, what that member of Congress is doing. When that member of Congress holds that constitutional office, they have a responsibility. Of course, they're going to frame that in a way that's going to make them look good, right? They're going to claim responsibility and credit for good things and deflect and blame others for the bad things. But I don't think, you know, full stop taking that away is really going to serve the general public. It's not going to serve voters, potential voters, their interests. The more we know, I think the better. But the thornier issue here then is this idea of, okay, well, what if we increased members' budgets, right? So with the hopes that they would then, you know, recalculate how they're going to allocate these resources. And we actually asked this question. So in 2017, several of us, which ultimately came out as our book, Congress Overwhelmed, but along with Alexander Furness and Alex Hertel-Fernandez, we engaged in this large-scale study that really took two parts. One was interviewing about 60 folks on senior staff on Capitol Hill. So we're talking chiefs of staff, members and staffers, high-level staffers in party leadership and committee offices, and even some former members of Congress. And also we sent a survey to generally everyone in Congress. And we asked many questions, but among them in the interviews with senior staff who have literally budget responsibility, so we know that they think about these things, is I sort of asked this sort of, you know, if I could wave a magic wand and double your budget tomorrow, how would you reallocate that money? And almost to a T, they said exactly what you're concerned about. They would just put more into what it is that they're already doing. And when we asked this more generally across a random sample of staffers, it was really the same thing, except really specifically that their number one priority would be to increase wages in existing salaries, you know, for existing positions, and because that has generally declined over time, and there's a lot of reasons for that we can get into. So that doesn't solve the problem, right? Simply adding more it would be effectively adding more fuel to the fire, right? So that tells me members of Congress and the committees, they have near full autonomy about how they go about spending taxpayer dollars in their official duties. Now, within constraints, they can't go out and buy a sports car or whatever, right? But within certain reasonable constraints, I think we have to ask, well, is that the right way to go about running the legislature, right? If we're allowing it, to me, it's a real a collective action failure. If you're allowing 535 members of Congress, 40 some committees, and who knows how many party leadership offices, all to make decisions completely independent from each other about how to allocate taxpayer money, I think it's very inefficient, right? So I think one way to do that would be to institutionalize exactly how, different pots of money being spent on different types of activities, right? That would give them certain constraints, right? To say only X% of your budget can go towards these sort of PR activities, right? Or those activities can only take place in a certain time relative to the campaign. Or, there are existing rules in Congress that already govern things like this, right? So that's unlikely because members of Congress don't want to give up that decision-making authority. Well, my response to that is too bad, right? The money doesn't belong to the member of Congress. It belongs to the district or the state, and it belongs to us. And I don't think it is completely unreasonable for the public to have a say about how we reasonably allocate that money, and to constrain them a bit, right? We constrain members of Congress and government officials' behavior in many ways, right? They can't take bribes, they can't do, they can't engage in conflicts of interest. Well, they also maybe ought not be able to spend taxpayer money to effectively get for their own reelection reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when you think about how that could be done, you centralize a lot of the decision-making in the body, versus give it, to individual members to spend. Mm-hmm. And then what would be the allocation ultimately for those PR positions? It's an interesting question. Yeah. So, what about the committees then? I mean, you could double a staff of committees, and theoretically, that would be a retention of expertise and capacity. Is that an option you think would be preferable to just increasing the individual member allocation?
I think it could be, and I also think this is an area where I can't say for sure yet. I know there's sort of work in progress of trying to answer these questions. But from what I can gather, at least anecdotally, from some of my interviews and speaking with folks, is that from the outside, we tend to, we have this very sort of textbook view of Congress that the committees is where the work gets done, right? That's where the bills are written and whatnot. Although that's technically true, committees today and the committee staff of today are very different than in their heyday of the 1970s. Right. So in the post-reform Congress in the 1970s, where power started accumulating in party leaders, but also it was the era of so-called subcommittee government, where the idea there was within the Democratic Party, they were trying to essentially claw back some party from long-standing committee chairs that just sort of ran their committees like a fiefdom, and if they chose not to do anything, they wouldn't do anything. And if you look back at that time, it was sort of a glorious chaos, right? You had a lot of subcommittees that might have been duplicative. You may have had these seemingly inefficient ways of they're all sort of investigating different problems and developing different solutions without talking to each other. But then it would ultimately be funneled up through the political party leaders, who would then essentially play traffic cop between whose ideas got to rise to the top and whose didn't. Well, now it's a completely different world. Now it's very top down, right? The party leaders essentially write the bills themselves. They bring the committee members in to the room for their advice, but it's Obamacare wasn't written by the House Commerce Committee. It was written by the Speaker, right? And then passed through the House Energy and Commerce Committee, right? So back to your question, if we were to double the budgets at committees, I don't know that would necessarily solve the problem, just like in member offices, because committees are now engaged in social media and in and in this sort of arena legislature activities, because Congress just isn't working on legislative activities as much. It's not to say that they're not doing anything, right? But there is less oversight. There is less investigation. There are fewer experts giving testimony. So if you double a committee's budget, chances are they're just going to double the allocations that they have now. They're going to improve their PR shop, and the members of the committee, especially in the majority party, will just simply use that to fill in where they can't use that money in their own personal office. So I think, again, I would say it would be probably a good idea to increase internally the resources that committees have access to, but also to do so in a much more careful and thoughtful way, and not simply allow it to become sort of funny money for the committee chairs and subcommittee chairs. So I think very similar problems at the committee level with the individual member level. And for them to change their mind about that, we have to sort of think about exactly what their incentive structure, what their trade-offs are as politicians when they're pursuing re-election. Can we get to a place where their efforts to get reelected are again tied back to the policy activities and the oversight that they're supposed to be doing, and not necessarily putting out the latest and greatest tweet.
It sounds like in order to get the committees to do their job effectively, you have to defund the leadership at the same time.
It could, but we have a curious situation in Congress where sort of authority and power has centralized into the party leadership structure. Again, I think that's tied, and this comes from Frances Lee of Princeton, who has written on this, that she that's tied to this idea of electoral competition, right? If I'm the Speaker of the House, or if I'm the minority leader, well, I'm going to be judged at how we do next election. So they're going to orient everything that way, and which has effectively broken down this idea of the division of labor, right? So rank and file members are taking orders from the party leader about go get reelected and do everything you can to get to that so that we can retain the majority next time. And rather, I think it could be a better allocation of resources if we said, okay, well, party leaders, sure, you're absolutely responsible for the party brand, for getting the message bills out, and for coordinating that message. In the meantime, while the party leaders are taking on that responsibility, members of Congress should be, investigating the Pentagon, or trying to think about what the next great solution is to hunger or homelessness. Right? And these days, those problems are getting brushed aside because their time is being taken up with one goal in mind. I tend to think that in a large organization, done well and done efficiently, Congress could chew and walk gum, or chew gum and walk at the same time, right? Just like Fortune 500 companies do, but right now it's just not. It's not designed that way, and I don't think that their members of Congress are, frankly, creative enough to try to spend enough of their own time in the brief time that they're there to try to rethink how Congress organizes and operates itself.
I've had Mickey Edwards on the program previously, and there's him and a few others, have, and I'm sympathetic to this notion that you could have a speaker who is not a member, right? Maybe a nonpartisan speaker who is really just making the institution work better as a whole, rather than taking partisan positions, which I find to be an odd situation. What's your opinion on that idea?
Well, first of all, I find it hard to believe that there could be any such thing in such a position as a person being nonpartisan. In a liberal democracy, the majority rules, right? And for the most part, and we can talk about some things like the Senate separately, but I think to an extent that model is much more like the British House of Commons, right? Where the Speaker in that institution is, holds this hat of sort of like the referee, right? And tries to manage the debate without fear or favor, right? And I think that's an attractive idea, but I find it difficult to believe that members of Congress would want to go along with that, right? So party leaders only have power to the extent that the individual members are going to delegate that power to them. So even though we might be able to create a position like that, I think it would largely be a position in name only. So that would be one thing. And the second thing here is at least in the House of Representatives, in some ways, there actually is an institutionalized position for things like this. It's the Chief Administrative Officer. The CIO was created back in the 1990s, part of the Republican contract with America, or at least stemming from it, that tried to move some of this sort of day-to-day operational stuff into more of an institutionalized office whose job it is to sort of manage, keep the lights on, allocate offices and sort of things like that. No different than the facilities and management folks here at my university, right? The problem there is that there ought to be, I think, a happy medium between the sort of nonpartisan speaker that actually has some power and influence and the chief administrative officer who doesn't do much more than sign the contract for the vendors that serve in the cafeteria, right? So I think maybe some kind of hybrid position there, or at least some sort of, perhaps the Speaker of the House could take a little bit more of a management role over some of these things. Long story short here is I think the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer, can't tell a member of Congress how to spend her money, right? They'll allocate the money, but they have no power to do so. And I think if for a real sort of centralized management to improve the efficiency of legislative capacity, you would have to have a position like that that had a little bit more teeth and that was able to constrain members' budgeting and behavior just a little bit more. So I think that Mickey Everett's hypothetical idea is really good, and he's of course a great institutionalist who I admire a lot. But I also don't think in day-to-day practice I can imagine having some sort of politics-free Speaker of the House. Because if you do, that person's just going to be replaced then by the majority leader, who will be the de facto speaker of today. So I think there are probably other ways at getting it sort of some intermediary solution.
Well, let's move on to the subject of this general notion of political elites and the flow of information. I think this is an area of your study now. And obviously it's all related to the things we're just discussing. So, what have you looked at in this area? How information flows? How do people who are really making the decisions get their information, and how do they use it?
Yeah. So this is largely coming from sort of the general field of political psychology in my discipline, who for many years have really made giant leaps forward of understanding how voters make decisions about how people consume political media and whatnot, but much of the focus of this area has been on like sort of the average person out there, right? And largely the big sort of takeaways there is the average voter, the average person. We don't think a whole great deal about the ins and outs of how government works and how policies might affect me and what my interests are. We instead, a lot like when we're consumers, we use quick and dirty shortcuts, right? I don't have the time or energy to think deeply about, how healthcare policy works or what kinds of, COVID mitigation strategies we ought to adopt. Instead, what I do is rely on shortcuts and we do this all over the place. I go to the supermarket, and when I'm walking down the cereal aisle, I have lots of options, right? And largely what I'm going to do, especially when my kids are with me, I'm going to grab the one that has the most sugar and make them happy, right? And because there's a big brand name on the front of it. We do the same thing in politics. We look at party labels, or we look at sort of ideological labels, and that serves as our shortcut so that I can then go on, get on with my day and make a choice. Well, the idea here of trying to look at political elites, congressional staff, lobbyists, bureaucrats, members of Congress, what have you, is they do the same thing, right? We have this sort of I think there is an implicit mythology out there that those who work professionally in politics and public policy, and that there's the professional nature of it means that how they go about making decisions is a lot careful and deliberative, that they weigh all the pros and cons of all the different options that are out there. We have this sort of idealistic view of that as if members of Congress are sort of like monks in a monastery trying to study the intricate details of a policy. That's not what they do. It's more like the cereal aisle. Right? Members of Congress, they're making decisions all the time, whether it's policy related, about how to communicate with their constituents, what meeting to go to next. Right? If you look at a member of Congress's schedule, they have 4 things happening at the same time. Right. So, and that's true off the Hill too, right? In think tanks and in newsrooms and in federal bureaucracies, that human beings, we process information using sort of tried and true shortcuts. Most of the time, those shortcuts are pretty good, right? They get us generally to the right place. But what they also do is introduce biases, right? There were some times when we make a decision, we overlook or ignore information that may have changed our mind. And so what I'm interested in is the extent to which political elites are actually doing this, or adopting these kind of shortcut behaviors, just like voters in the election booth or consumers in the supermarket, right? So again, it's sort of early on, and a number of colleagues are looking at some of these things. But for example, a couple of years ago, just 2 years ago, we did a survey of about 4,500 political elites in Washington and asked them any number of questions. And one study that we embedded in that survey was an experiment that essentially asked political elites about essentially their opinions on several issues, right? So it could be climate change or healthcare spending or whatnot, right? And so we did that in the first part of the survey. And then later, somewhere else later in the survey, we asked them, what do you think the general public thinks about these issues? Right? The idea by separating them, it kind of breaks it up in their mind. And what we found, this is based on some people did similar studies of congressional staff, and ultimately they found that they thought the general public was more conservative than it actually is. Well, we found something very different from particularly these unelected elites that don't have this re-election motivation. Instead, they believe the general public thinks what they think, right? So their bias is, John Q. Public and Jane Q. Public thinks what I think about climate change, because the world in which they live, the people who they talk to, is frankly very unrepresentative of the average person. So it was neither in a liberal or a conservative direction, but it was the bias that's entering their mind, and the shortcut that they're using is literally looking in the mirror, thinking about what other people think, right? So here's one example of essentially taking these highly professional, well-experienced, highly educated political professionals and sort of catching them in the act of using these cognitive shortcuts. And we think that this has a lot of implications for how they seek out information in order to inform their own sort of policy decisions and activities. But it also has a lot of implications for policy and political deliberation more broadly, that, we can think of in an idealized world, political deliberation, we should, look at a lot of diverse perspectives and incorporate a lot of different ideas, and then ultimately reach the most reasoned choice. But that's not possible if what it is you're doing is automatically cutting off certain bits of information, because it just simply takes less time and cognitive energy to rely on your gut. And your gut might get you there most of the time, but sometimes it might introduce a bias, and you can end up making bad decisions.
Yeah, I think some of that comes from the conception of representation, right? So if I I'm narrowly construing my duty as a representative to just the groups of people that elected me or think like me, then that's going to be a natural crutch. And
Mhm.
similarly, there's this concept of the dialogue in Congress, right? Debate, dialogue. In
Mhm.
theory, that's the idea that should poke through some of those assumptions, right? To give some unwelcome information into your worldview.
Right.
But that's also, broken down, unfortunately, in Congress.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that this is exactly where it is related to some of the work I've been doing on legislative capacity. The staffers who work on the Hill are really smart, highly motivated, and are genuinely motivated for good public service for the most part. And you'd think that alone ought to produce sort of the highest quality of dialogue and deliberation, because they ought to be seeking all these out. But because they are so inundated by information, it's often referred to on the Hill as drinking from the fire hose, that there is so much information and so little time, and also not unrelated to the fact that there's so few resources to back them up, that they're that much more likely to rely on shortcuts like and that typically in a world of polarized political parties, right, that means they're going to automatically shut off the other side and ignore the other side. And that's some other research some other things that we've uncovered in our research is that we embedded an experiment in another survey with congressional staff, and what we end up finding is not so much that they're not willing to grant access to donors or constituents or lobbyists, but that after they grant that access, they're only inclined to use or interpret information as being good or sound if it's coming from a party-aligned source. Right? So anything else, even regardless of what the substance it is, that party and ideology are gobbling up all of their attention. It's sort of like the master key to solve every problem. And I think, as it turns out, I think a lot of even the average person out there is going to think that it's not the solution to the problem; it is the problem, right? So, so I think that what some of this might help inform us is not just throwing money at the problem and hiring more staff, but to try to rethink about how do we set up processes for that are allowing even uncomfortable ideas in, and ideas that I specifically disagree with, because the response to speech is counter speech, right? The response to ideas is countervailing ideas, and that is, I think, often being lost in the process that we have these days today.
All right. Well, with that, maybe we can move on to the second phase of our discussion, where I ask
Sure.
you questions I've asked everybody else on the program, and so that ultimately we can compare results. So, are you ready for the next phase?
Sure.
The first question is in this line is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
That is that's a complex question. I think in order to understand, I think we want to break this down in some ways. I think for the most part, we presume congressional representation has to be tied to voters and constituents. I think that's false, however, right? And there's years of studies in Congress is trying to understand that. Is just because a member of Congress represents a line drawn arbitrarily on a map somewhere, whether that line is a state border or a congressional district. Districts anymore are so large and members are so detached, they can never actually fully know what their genuine geographic constituency is. So that even though they might want to faithfully represent what they think their constituency is, it's impossible. So in actuality, what members of Congress, they create a vision in their mind about what they believe their constituency actually is, and it's always false. By definition, it's going to be selective. It's going to be the people that they come in contact with most. It's going to be, and that is going to include party activists and donors and people who call a congressional office to complain, right? So at some level, that's important, but it's also not very helpful, right? In some respect, members of Congress ought to make difficult decisions with the best information available, and wherever the political chips fall, so be it, right? But that's not necessarily the attitude. So instead, I think what good representation in a legislative setting ought to be is members of Congress being forthright and honest with themselves about who and what they believe that they represent, and trying to stick with that as faithfully as possible. And then voters can judge on that, right? So what I mean here is members of Congress, depending on the policy issue, are going to, in their mind's eye, have a different sort of a set of fictional constituencies that who they believe are going to be affected by that, by any kind of policy decision, right? So if it's healthcare policy, it's a different set of people. If it's national security policy, it's going to be a different set of folks who are going to be impacted. And I think it's okay to make decisions with an eye towards these identifiable and knowable, sub-constituencies, and then go explain that generally to the public at large. Right now, I think members of Congress are afraid to publicly recognize that that when they make decisions, they're doing so for a narrow set of people, or groups or organizations. But I think it would be healthy for them to be a little bit more transparent about that to both themselves and to voters. And then I think also we can't ignore identity in representation, right? So Congress remains a members-only club of primarily white, wealthy men, right? And that has changed quite a bit in my adult life for the better. Congress is becoming much more diverse, but it's also far from being genuinely representative of a large number of ideological groups. Race and ethnicity and gender are absolutely important. Gender expansive definitions are absolutely critical because it's what real life is, but also geography and economic interests, right? So members of Congress come to their job with a great deal of wealth and usually with experience in some kind of professional setting in which they earned a lot of money. And they might believe that experience has exposed them to a wide variety of viewpoints when frankly, it's very rare for a member of Congress to have driven a truck or worked in a factory or cleaned a hotel room. And I think that's another area where I think representation through experience, descriptive representation could be an area for improvement. And I think the parties both parties could benefit from trying to expand what who they believe that are sort of fall under their large tent of what these party coalitions are. That might be.
So I'm trying to understand a little bit. This is a question about what you think it should be, rather than what it is. I understand the problem of a member never knowing really what's going on in the district. It's an impossibility, and I'm sympathetic to this idea that even if you spent every day of every minute of the year, shaking hands with your constituents, you're still going to be in the realm of error to understand what's really going on with those constituents. So I agree that the member has to have some kind of imagination to really understand who their constituents are. But I guess the question I have for you is, do they represent, this fictitious group they're creating? Is it every human being in the district? Is it their primary voters? Is it, the medical boards? In the should question to you is, should the member represent everyone or some subset of that everyone?
I think the member should have, I'll go back to the word, the capacity to at least have the ability or to represent a variety of different groups, whether it's the medical boards or the CEOs or the laborers or the retirees, what have you, right? So they themselves, it's an impossibility as we can get to. So I think how do you bridge that gap between the life experiences and knowledge and relationships that an individual member of Congress has, representing a broad and diverse district or state. Well, I think one way to do that is to have a staff that might be representative, right? Have those experiences themselves. We can't expect every member of Congress to go back in time and relive their lives in order to be a representative. So I think what they could do is surround themselves by people who might have different expertise, backgrounds, life experiences, and a variety of different kinds of identities, so that I might personally not know, if I'm a member of Congress, I might not know what it's like to be a woman, right? But if I could have a professional staff who are expert on women's perspectives on certain policy issues, it's imperfect, but it's better than me filling in the blanks. So I think one way to get to this sort of should question, how should members of Congress represent their constituents, it is, I think they should closely surround themselves by a much more diverse and representative group of people.
All right, next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And this means DC versus district, legislation versus oversight versus dialing for dollars, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, if I had my way, an ideal Congress would hyper focus on public policy outside, sort of this defined campaign season. Of course, I'm not naive. The campaign season is every day, right? So I think a better allocation of time at minimum would be more time in Washington, doing Washington work. Right now, what happens is members of Congress arrive on a Tuesday morning in a legislative week and are itching to get back on the plane by Thursday afternoon. That means they have all this stuff to do in a 3-day work week. Now, keep in mind that I'm not one of those people who believes that that means the rest of the time they're on vacation, right? They're back in the district doing very important work. But what I would like to see is much larger chunks of time. Members of Congress shouldn't leave Washington for weeks or months at a time, right? They all have second residences, right? They earn a heck of a lot of money to be able to pay for that too, right? So I'm not concerned so much about that, but this is a big change that happened in the 1990s. And again, this is related to that electoral competition world that we live in. Every spare moment's got to be directed towards that. So one chunk of time would be to spend considerable long periods of time, including the weekends, and they might not have to go into the office, but don't go home, right? They have staff back in the district to do that. And then when they're in Washington, when they're in session, they shouldn't have to be able to walk across the street to the RNC and the DNC to go dial for dollars, right? And that's where much of the problem exists. So members of Congress are estimated to be spending at least half of their time while in Washington working on a campaign fundraising. And I think, like many state legislatures out there, it would be possible to come up with a system of, when you're in Washington, you are in this set period of time where we're doing legislative and budget work. That's what you have to be doing. We're going to cut the faucets off from the donors, focus our attention on this. It's perfectly understandable and reasonable that they have to spend some time raising money for expensive campaigns and engaging in campaigns. Campaigns are healthy for democracy, right? But I think we could reallocate the time into much larger chunks to be able to focus on those things. And I think it'd be okay to give members certain time to be able to hold fundraisers and go back in their district and go to the Kiwanis Club and whatnot. But I think that would be a much better allocation. So right now, I think less than half of their time is spent in Washington, and of that time in Washington, less than half of their time is spent doing lawmaking duties. I think that could be pretty easily changed.
Right. Next one is how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Should it be the floor, committees, behind closed doors, out in the open, in the bar, where should all this discussion and some of the thing you mentioned earlier about contrary ideas, where should they be aired?
Yeah, I think this is an area where there's a lot of different solutions, and Congress ought to look outside of politics for the solution here. I think those who study organizations and companies and how employees work together and how teams work together, the most efficient and a productive organization for working is to have sort of small groups and small working groups and teams. Or as originally envisioned, congressional committees were intended to do that, right? The logic behind a congressional committee is divide up the labor, right? And this committee works on healthcare, this committee works on national security, what have you. But now these committees are so large that they are themselves too big, right? So I think a much better way to do this would be to have small working groups, each given a certain problem, right? And that those working groups ought to be somewhat representative of a diversity of viewpoints. And it should be okay for some of these working groups to be duplicative. There's value in redundancy sometimes, right? A lot of times in certain operations, right? You want to be more efficient. But in other times, especially when it comes to solving public problems that are extremely complex, it is useful to take different bites of the same apple from different perspectives. So I think it would be, and we know this from even observing members of Congress, that ideological opposite members, when they actually do get in a room and talk to each other, they can be very productive. And most legislation is still bipartisan. They typically have sponsors from both parties and getting votes from both parties, and the problem is there's not enough of that. I think that because of the limits on their time and their constraints, that they don't have the time to be in the room with people they might otherwise disagree with and get to know. Whether that's at a bar or a restaurant in the evening or in an office room during the day, I think it would be, I'm less concerned about that as it is a dedication and a commitment to spending a significant amount of time surrounding yourselves with folks who you might disagree with, so that you can literally hear the other side.
All right, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
That's here's a big question. I think generally sort of two responses, because it's a very sort of macro level question. So my response will be at the very macro level. One would be outside of Congress. Congress is a product of American politics, right? How Congress goes about doing its job. And I think in political science, when you look at other countries and other legislatures, the near consensus among political scientists is that the worst way to run a nation state is a presidential system with a federalist structure and a bicameral legislature, right? And the exact system that we have. We're not necessarily going to redo that, but with only two political parties. What we can change is that two political party aspect, and most now how we get there, a lot of political scientists and political analysts are going to disagree with about how you might implement. But if we could get to a place where both of the political parties at any given time are going to be effectively dominated by an internal faction, if we could get to a place where those factions are actually separate parties, and that would then be essentially forced to work together in coalitions, whether it's on a specific bill or more generally setting up the organization of the government. I think multi-party systems are not flawless, right? But certainly much better. So the number one thing to change would be to move towards something like a proportional representation system, which out of which you'd get multiple parties. And then secondly, inside Congress, this sort of macro level question is to reimagine what Congress actually is. Congress, basically the way that Congress is organized now is a series of solutions that were political problems that needed solving by politicians that are long dead, right? Political parties were invented to solve, a geographic coalition building back in the 19th century. Committees were invented to solve sort of divisional labor problems across different parties and with different economic constituencies in different areas, right? We still have these systems, and they've been tweaked over time. But I think in a 50-year time period, we could easily map out, well, what would be the ideal way of setting up a system that would recognize the different tasks that elected members of Congress need to satisfy. They need to serve their constituents. They need to communicate with the public. And they need to solve problems and oversee the executive. And right now, all those problems are all solved equally by this mishmash of organizational features inside Congress. And I think if we re-envision about how we might go about doing that, we might come up with something similar, but I think it would look very different, and it would be a lot more fluid, so that from Congress to Congress, members, there would be an incentive to change and improve and be more flexible over time, just like Fortune 500 companies. If they're not changing, they're going to be dying, right? So Congress doesn't work like that. And I think with a little bit of effort and a little bit of ingenuity and commitment, it probably could.
All right, next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Two in mind from mentors of mine. First would be Rick Hall's 1996 book, Participation in Congress. One of my favorite reads when I was in graduate school, because it was the first book as a graduate student I read that actually spoke to my day-to-day experience when I was working on the Hill. And really what the innovation of this book was to move away from looking at Congress and congressional activity and productivity merely as if it's like a factory, a sausage factory, right, with outputs. And instead of looking at the outputs, instead looking at what are what's the day-to-day inputs that members of Congress are doing. So instead of just looking at roll call votes on bills, which is absolutely important, also let's look at, well, what do members of Congress do with their time? Do they attend committee hearings? They don't always. If they attend, do they ask questions? If so, how many? What kinds? Are they good or bad questions? And exactly, and that tells us a little bit more about how Congress works, right? So that's influenced a lot of how I've gone about looking at this information. And I would add a second here, again, from mentors of mine, Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones. They have a series of work that speaks to the policy process through their theory of punctuated equilibrium, but in particular their I think 2016 book, if I'm getting the date right, called The Politics of Information, is they've really tried to take seriously how, from a systems perspective of thinking about how do governments seek out and use and process the information that's available to them. And there are different behavioral ways of managing information. And what was really insightful about that for me is that they showed, whether it's the administrative side or the executive side or the legislative side, is that the politics of information seeking back in the 1970s and 1980s was very different, because you had the parties that were their ideologies did not determine what their outcome was, right? There was sort of overlapping coalitions, and that how they process information changed over time, where they used to look for diverse perspectives, because studying an issue led to a conclusion. Now, in a world of polarized parties and heightened electoral competition, they start with the outcome, what their decision is, and their information seeking process is simply confirmatory. And I think that tells us a lot, and I think is partly consistent with some of the stuff that I've been talking about today, that I think is really useful and helpful, and hopefully other folks are going to read too.
So the last question is really about your future. Like what's in the hopper for your research in the short term and in the long term?
Yeah, I think generally working on this idea of the information search and use behavior among political elites is really at the top of my agenda now. I'm still, of course, working on a number of these legislative capacity issue problems. As you know, in the academic world, our production schedule is on a 5 and 6 year cycle. And so, but I think with a direction of really looking at political elites and mostly how political elites don't just use information generally, not, because the information might be, what do my constituents think about these things, or what's public opinion say, but most specifically expertise and expert information. We live in a world now that we've seen, and with the climate crisis and with COVID-19, of many politicians sort of eschewing experts and inserting what their own belief systems is on top of that. And so one of the puzzles I think I'm really curious about it is I can understand an election-oriented politician sort of waving their hand away at information that doesn't agree with what their re-election message is. I don't understand that as much with sort of a bureaucrat at the FDA or a scholar at a think tank. Why is it that other types of political elites who might not be bound by election, how do they go about seeking out and using expertise and scientific information and other sort of information and data produced by people with highly specialized skills and expert knowledge?
Excellent. Well, Professor LaPira, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck in your future work.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you.